In 2013, a city council in central Germany approved what looked like the most mundane infrastructure decision imaginable. An old, empty grain storage building sitting unused in the middle of Erfurt was finally going to be knocked down and turned into a parking lot. Standard urban renewal, the kind of decision made in city halls every single day without a second thought. Except this particular granary had been built in the 15th century, directly on top of something the builders knew exactly what they were burying, a Jewish cemetery. And when construction crews broke ground for that parking lot, German law required an archaeological rescue excavation first, which is how a routine infrastructure project accidentally triggered what scientists would later call the largest ancient Jewish DNA study ever conducted. One that didn't just add a footnote to Jewish history, it rewrote the timeline of one of the most genetically studied populations on Earth, using nothing but 38 teeth, pulled from the ground beneath a parking lot. To put in perspective just how significant that sounds inside the world of population genetics, ancient Jewish DNA is astonishingly rare in the scientific record. Jewish religious law places some of the strictest restrictions of any major tradition on disturbing human remains, which means that while archaeologists have pulled ancient DNA from thousands of skeletons across Europe over the past 2 decades, rewriting our understanding of nearly every other population on the continent, the genetic history of medieval European Jews had remained almost entirely dark, reconstructed only indirectly through mathematical models applied to living populations, never through direct physical evidence from the people themselves. Erfurt changed that in a single publication, and it changed it dramatically. To understand why this discovery hit as hard as it did in the scientific community, you have to understand what Erfurt actually was. Between the late 11th century and 1454, Erfurt was home to one of the largest and most significant Jewish communities. Anywhere in medieval Germany, a genuine center of Ashkenazi life for roughly 3.5 centuries. It wasn't a footnote community. It was one of the pillars of early Europe. The exact population historians and geneticists have spent decades trying to understand the origins of. But that history was violent almost from the start. In 1349, as the Black Death tore across Europe, Jewish communities throughout the continent were falsely blamed for causing the plague, and Erfurt's Jewish population was slaughtered in a massacre so severe the community essentially had to be rebuilt from scratch by new settlers in the years that followed. It survived that, rebuilt, thrived again for another century, and then in 1454 the city expelled every remaining Jew for good. The cemetery was sealed. A granary went up, directly on top of it in the 15th century, and for over 500 years that was that. A community erased so thoroughly that even the ground it was buried under got repurposed for grain storage, then decades later for a parking lot, with almost nobody left alive who remembered exactly what lay underneath. It's worth sitting with the layered cruelty of that timeline for a second, because the granary itself wasn't built by accident on top of a cemetery nobody knew about. It was built deliberately on land the city had every reason to know was a Jewish burial ground, in the immediate aftermath of an expulsion that had just emptied the community out of the city entirely. Building a grain store directly over a people's graves within living memory of their expulsion wasn't an oversight. It was closer to an erasure, a physical statement that the community and its dead no longer had any claim to the ground beneath the city, that the site would, 5.5 centuries later, become the source of the single most detailed genetic record of medieval Ashkenazi life ever recovered, is the kind of historical irony that's almost too pointed to be real, and yet it's exactly what happened. Here's where the story becomes genuinely remarkable, because excavating a Jewish cemetery is not something that happens casually, and it's not something a research team can simply decide to do on their own terms. Jewish religious law places extremely strict restrictions on disturbing the dead, and any legitimate archaeological work on a Jewish burial site requires close cooperation and explicit approval from the local Jewish community and religious authorities, which is exactly what happened here. Working with the approval of Germany's Jewish community and led by geneticist Shai Carmi at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, alongside the renowned ancient DNA laboratory of David Reich at Harvard Medical School, researchers recovered 38 teeth from the rescue. Excavation and successfully extracted usable ancient DNA from 33 individuals, all buried in that cemetery during the 14th century, meaning these are actual medieval Ashkenazi Jews, not modern descendants, not historical inference, actual centuries-old genetic material pulled directly from the people who lived and died in that community. The remains themselves, once the genetic sampling was complete, were respectfully reburied in a 19th century Jewish cemetery nearby, honoring the same religious principles that made the whole project possible in the first place. Published in the journal Cell in December of 2022, the resulting study didn't just add data points to an existing picture of Ashkenazi history, it fundamentally challenged assumptions researchers had been building for over a decade. The research team itself was substantial, drawing together specialists from Hebrew University, Harvard Medical School, and several other institutions, combining expertise in ancient DNA extraction, population genetics, archaeology, and even isotope chemistry. Because a project like this doesn't succeed on genetics alone, it requires an entire interdisciplinary operation working in close coordination with a living religious community whose trust and formal approval had to be earned and maintained at every single step of the process, from the initial excavation permit through to the final reburial once the sampling was complete. To understand exactly what got overturned, you need the background these researchers were working against. For years, the dominant scientific understanding of Ashkenazi Jewish genetic history rested heavily on studying modern populations and mathematically calculating backward, essentially reverse engineering history from present-day DNA. That approach had produced a widely cited estimate, a severe founder event, a population bottleneck occurring somewhere between 600 and 800 years ago, meaning roughly the 12th to 14th century, the era of the Crusades and escalating European persecution. It was a solid evidence-based estimate built on genuinely careful statistical work. But it was still an estimate built entirely on modern genomes, working backward through mathematical models rather than looking directly at the ancestors themselves. The Erfurt discovery changed that completely, because for the first time, researchers had actual genetic material from Ashkenazi Jews who were alive during the exact window that bottleneck was supposed to have happened, and what they found didn't just confirm the old estimate, it pushed the timeline further back than anyone had firmly established before. The first major finding, and arguably the single most important one for rewriting the historical timeline, involved something called runs of homozygosity, a genetic signature researchers use to detect inbreeding and small population sizes. Essentially, when a population has been small and somewhat closed for a while, individuals start inheriting identical stretches of DNA from both parents at elevated rates, because the family tree keeps looping back on itself within a limited pool of ancestors. When Carmi's team analyzed the Erfurt genomes, they found exactly this signature already present in 14th century individuals, at levels indicating the population had already undergone a substantial reduction in size by the time these specific people were alive and being buried in that cemetery. In plain terms, the genetic bottleneck that shaped the entire future of Ashkenazi Jewish genetics wasn't happening during the 14th century, as the earlier modern DNA-based models had estimated. It had already happened before then. The Erfurt community was living downstream of that bottleneck, not in the middle of it, which means the actual founder event has to be pushed back earlier in history than researchers had previously pinned down with direct physical evidence, a genuinely significant revision built on hard genetic data rather than statistical extrapolation. Carmi himself, discussing the findings publicly after publication, framed the core goal of the entire project simply, explaining that the team set out specifically to fill the gaps in scientific understanding of early Ashkenazi Jewish history using direct ancient DNA evidence rather than relying solely on inference. That's a modest way of describing a study that ended up revising one of the field's central timelines, but it captures something true about how the best historical genetics actually works, not through dramatic proclamations, but through patiently letting physical evidence correct assumptions that had, until that point, seemed reasonably solid simply because nothing better had existed to test them against. This distinction matters, because reverse engineering history from modern DNA, however careful the mathematics, always carries an inherent risk of being thrown off by anything that happened in the intervening centuries, additional bottlenecks, migrations, or admixture events that modern models have to try to account for or filter out statistically, often without being fully certain they've succeeded. Direct ancient DNA sidesteps that uncertainty almost entirely. It's not an inference about the past, it's a physical sample from the past. And when Carmi's team ran the same runs of homozygosity analysis on the 14th century Erfurt genomes that had previously only been run on modern populations, and found the same bottleneck signature already firmly in place centuries earlier than expected, that wasn't a refinement of the old estimate. It was direct physical proof the old estimate needed correcting. Then comes a finding that's almost stranger because it runs directly against what most people would instinctively assume about population history. You'd expect a population to become more genetically diverse over time as it grows, spreads geographically, and mixes with more people. The Erfurt data shows the opposite happened to Ashkenazi Jews. The 14th century Erfurt community was measurably more genetically diverse and heterogeneous than modern Ashkenazi Jewish populations are today. Researchers identified two genetically distinguishable subgroups coexisting within that single medieval community, one showing stronger genetic affinity to Middle Eastern populations, and the other showing a noticeably higher degree of Eastern European ancestry, quite possibly reflecting migrants who had arrived in Erfurt from further east in Europe and joined the existing community there. And here's the detail that makes it even more fascinating. When researchers checked whether these two genetically distinct groups were buried separately, clustered in different sections of the cemetery, or showed any sign of social or temporal separation, they found nothing. No spatial pattern, no clustering by grave location, no evidence these two genetically different populations were treated as separate groups within the community at all. They lived together, worshiped together, and were buried together as one unified Jewish community despite carrying genetically distinguishable ancestry, which tells you something quietly profound about how 14th century Ashkenazi identity worked. It wasn't defined by a single narrow genetic thread. It was already, at that point in history, a community built from multiple converging migration streams that considered themselves and were buried as one people. This is arguably the single most quietly powerful finding in the entire study because it complicates a simplistic, single origin story of Ashkenazi identity that's often repeated in popular accounts, the idea of one small founding group multiplying in isolation for 1,000 years. The Erfurt evidence tells a more textured story instead, one where 14th century Ashkenazi identity was already an active, ongoing process of absorption and integration, where people, arriving from different regions with genuinely different ancestral backgrounds, could become, within a generation or two, fully part of the same religious and cultural community, indistinguishable in the eyes of the people who buried them, regardless of what a geneticist 800 years later would eventually be able to detect in their DNA. So if 14th century Ashkenazi Jews were more genetically diverse than today's Ashkenazi Jews, what happened between then and now to narrow that diversity back down? This is where geneticist Shai Carmi's own comparison becomes the crux of the entire story. Modern Ashkenazi Jews, whether you sample them in New York, Tel Aviv, London, or Buenos Aires, are remarkably genetically similar to one another today, almost indistinguishable as a single, tight population, regardless of where in the world their families ended up. That level of modern genetic homogeneity had generally been assumed to be roughly how the population always looked, going back centuries. The Erfurt data proves that assumption wrong. The tight genetic uniformity we see in Ashkenazi Jews today isn't an ancient, unchanging feature of the population. It's the end result of a further narrowing that happened sometime after the 14th century, likely tied to the additional waves of persecution, expulsion, and demographic upheaval that continued sweeping through European Jewish communities for centuries after Erfurt's own community was wiped out in 1454. In other words, the genetic story of Ashkenazi Jews isn't one single ancient bottleneck event that happened once and then stayed frozen. It's at least two separate narrowing events stacked on top of each other, an earlier one that had already occurred before the 14th century, and a later one that continued compressing the population's genetic diversity even further. Sometime after Erfurt's community was destroyed, all the way up until the more genetically uniform population we can study today. Think about what that actually implies for anyone tracing their own Ashkenazi ancestry today, whether through a genealogy website or a consumer DNA test. The tight, easily identifiable Ashkenazi Jewish genetic signature those tests rely on isn't some primordial unchanging marker stretching back 1,000 years to the community's very origin. It's the product of a second, later narrowing, layered on top of an already narrow medieval population, meaning the full genetic story of Ashkenazi ancestry is considerably more layered and considerably more recent in parts of its formation than most people, including many geneticists working from modern samples alone, had previously assumed. Now for the haplogroup itself, the specific detail that gives this discovery its edge, because it's genuinely one of the strangest and most debated findings in the entire study. A full third of the individuals buried in that medieval Erfurt cemetery carried the exact same maternal mitochondrial haplogroup, a lineage that today is found almost exclusively within Ashkenazi Jewish populations and essentially nowhere else in Europe at meaningful frequency. Finding a third of an entire medieval sample sharing one specific maternal lineage is itself a striking sign of how narrow the founding maternal population really was, reinforcing everything the runs of homozygosity data was already suggesting about an early, severe bottleneck. But what makes this particular haplogroup so genuinely strange is where else in the world it turns up. Researchers and independent population geneticists studying the same lineage have noted it appears at low but real frequency in populations across northern and central Asia, and even, oddly, among some Volga-Ural Tatar and Bashkir populations, as well as scattered traces in southwestern Russia and parts of the Czech Republic. A maternal lineage with its deepest roots tracing back toward Neolithic-era populations in East Asia, showing up as one of the dominant maternal lines in a medieval German Jewish cemetery, is exactly the kind of finding that sends geneticists back to the drawing board on migration routes, raising still unresolved questions about exactly which populations and migration paths fed into the earliest Ashkenazi founding mothers centuries before anyone was writing any of it down. Geneticists studying mitochondrial lineages generally rely on comparing a haplogroup's frequency and distribution across many different populations to triangulate where and when it likely originated and how it spread. And for most European maternal lineages, that process produces a reasonably clean, expected answer rooted somewhere in Europe or the Near East. This particular lineage refuses to cooperate with that clean story. Its scattered, low-frequency presence across such a wide and disconnected geographic range, from Central Asian steppe populations to isolated pockets in the Volga. Region to a 14th century German Jewish cemetery doesn't fit neatly into any single simple migration narrative, and researchers studying it are still actively debating exactly which ancient population or populations first carried it westward, and by what route it eventually became so disproportionately common among the founding mothers of Ashkenazi Jewry specifically. It's the kind of loose thread that good science doesn't try to neatly tie off before the evidence actually supports it, and it remains genuinely one of the open questions the Erfurt discovery raised rather than closed. There's one more layer to the Erfurt findings that adds a genuinely human dimension to all of this genetic and statistical analysis, because among the 33 individuals sequenced, researchers were able to identify actual family relationships preserved directly in the DNA. 2 separate family pedigrees emerged from the data, individuals who were first-degree relatives of each other, parents and children, or siblings buried within the same cemetery, sometimes with additional relatives inferred from the genetic patterns even where their own remains weren't part of the sample. For a moment, strip away the statistics and the population genetics jargon, and what you're actually looking at is a mother and her child or 2 siblings who lived and died and were buried together in that cemetery over 600 years ago, and whose relationship to each other survived, invisible and unspoken, in fragments of DNA sealed in tooth enamel under a granary and then a parking lot for over 5 centuries, until a research team with the right tools and the right permission finally read it back out. Researchers were able to reconstruct these pedigrees using the same genome-wide data collected for the population-level analysis, essentially comparing how much DNA any 2 individuals in the sample shared and at what pattern the same underlying method modern consumer DNA testing companies use today to connect living relatives who've never met. The difference here is that both people being compared have been dead for over 600 years, and neither of them ever could have imagined that a shared fragment of genetic code, inherited silently and without any of them ever intending it as a message to the future, would one day be read by. And then there's the medical dimension of this discovery, which connects Erfurt's medieval community directly to the health of millions of people alive today. Among the 33 individuals studied, researchers identified 8 who carried genetic variants known today to cause specific inherited diseases still associated with Ashkenazi Jewish populations, the same cluster of conditions including Tay-Sachs disease, Gaucher disease, and several other disorders that modern genetic counselors specifically screen for in Ashkenazi Jewish patients and couples today. Finding these exact same disease-causing variants already present in a 14th century population confirms something researchers had long suspected but had never been able to directly verify with hard evidence, that the elevated carrier rates for these specific conditions in the Ashkenazi Jewish population today aren't some modern development. They're a direct, unbroken genetic inheritance from a population that was already carrying these same variants over 600 years ago, amplified across the centuries by exactly the same founder effect the rest of the Erfurt data was independently confirming. There's a genuinely practical, present-day dimension to this, finding too beyond its historical value. Genetic counselors who work with Ashkenazi Jewish patients today rely on carrier screening panels specifically built around this cluster of founder mutations, testing prospective parents before pregnancy to identify whether both partners carry a recessive variant for the same condition, since a child only develops these diseases if they inherit the mutated gene from both parents, confirming that these exact same variants were already circulating in a 14th century population doesn't change the screening recommendations doctors give today, but it does something arguably more valuable for anyone going through that process. It grounds a clinical checklist in 600 years of continuous, documented family history, transforming an abstract genetic risk category into something with a real, traceable human lineage behind it. Step back and look at everything the Erfurt Cemetery actually delivered, and it becomes clear why researchers describe this as reshaping, not just supplementing, existing Ashkenazi genetic history. A population bottleneck that had to be pushed earlier than the 14th century, based on direct physical evidence rather than backward modeling. A medieval community that was measurably more genetically diverse than its modern descendants, built from at least two distinguishable ancestral streams that lived and were buried together without any sign of internal division. A dominant maternal lineage whose deepest roots trace improbably far east into territory that raises real, still, unresolved questions about the earliest Ashkenazi migration story, actual family relationships preserved across 6 centuries in tooth enamel, and a direct genetic link verified rather than assumed between conditions still screened for in Ashkenazi Jewish medicine today. None of it was sitting in a museum or a manuscript or an oral tradition passed down through careful retelling. It was sitting under a 15th century granary that became an empty building, that became, almost as an afterthought, a parking lot. And it took a routine city construction permit, the right religious cooperation, and 38 recovered teeth to bring 900 years of buried history back into the light, rewriting the timeline of an entire population, one genome at a time. And perhaps the most striking part of the whole story is how close it came to never happening at all. If the granary had simply been left standing or torn down decades earlier, before ancient DNA extraction techniques had matured to the point where usable genetic material could reliably be pulled from centuries-old tooth enamel, or if the city had chosen almost any other use for that lot, this entire body of evidence would still be sitting silently underground, exactly where it had sat undisturbed for over 500 years already. Instead, a parking lot renovation, an archaeological law requiring a rescue excavation, and the careful, respectful cooperation of a modern Jewish community with a research team willing to do the work properly combined to hand historians and geneticists something that mathematics and modern DNA alone could never have fully provided on their own, direct, physical, incontrovertible testimony from the people who actually lived through the centuries everyone else had only ever been able to reconstruct secondhand.